The single biggest takeaway of the last 5 weeks is that everything, and I mean everything that the Russians were bad at before, propaganda, logistics, precision, training, maintenance, equipment, everything that they were bad at before, they're worse now. The Russian offensive has stalled pretty much everywhere, and there's two big reasons for this. The first, and the most spectacularly, and in many ways impressively, is that in the past 6 weeks, Ukraine has shifted the type of war that it is fighting. They've gone from predominantly trying to arrest the Russian advance with things like Stingers and Javelins, shoulder-mounted weapons, to an ever-increasing number and ever-increasing style, heavier artillery. That has enabled Ukraine to increasingly strike deep behind enemy lines, blow up ammo dumps, destroy logistical hubs, damage infrastructure, and even get to the point of assassinating military leadership. Some of the Wagner bases, these are Russia's mercenaries, have been just destroyed. In other places, they've found out that a number of officers were getting together for a happy hour and they hit the bar. The degree to which the Ukrainians are able to put targeting information either from their own human network or signal intelligence that is provided by the Americans and put it to use has been very impressive, and it has snarled the entirety of the Russian advance in both the east and the south. Second, and perhaps even a little bit more significantly than the Ukrainian increasing battle prowess, is that Russia may be running out of ammunition. Now, the Russians don't fight wars like most modern militaries, certainly not like the United States. The United States does high-impact, long-range, deep penetration to prevent the front from ever even forming. That's not how the Russians do it. The Russians use trains to supply a nearly bottomless supply of materiel and fuel and ammo to the front line, and then they assault the entire front line with a massive amount of artillery, destroying everything they see in their path and incrementally advancing maybe a mile a day. Now, Russian maintenance of anything has never been great, especially in the post-Soviet system, and explosives, like food, have use-by dates. Typically for artillery shells, you don't want to use anything that's more than 20-25 years old. Well, Russia really hasn't built much in the last 30 years. We don't know a huge amount about Russian conventional forces because they're not sharing the data, but we do know that they faced a massive industrial collapse in the 1990s that they never really recovered from. And they have fought 3 artillery-intensive wars since the Soviet collapse, 2 in Chechnya and then 1 in Syria. So now the Russians are attempting to advance over a front that's 1,000 miles long, with a burn rate for their artillery in excess of 40,000 shells a day, going through a relatively small, by Soviet standards, arsenal that has been acquired since the Soviet collapse, when the industrial system collapsed as well. Any equipment, any shells that they're going to use that are not from that stack are things that were built before 1989, meaning that they're in excess of 30 years old. We've seen reports several a year in Russia going back 30 years that every once in a while one of these shells, because it falls or just has a problem, cooks off, and the entire ammo dump goes up. It's entirely possible that some of the explosions we're seeing in places like Beograd or Western Russia are not actually being caused by the Ukrainians, but by the Russians' manhandling of their own equipment. But regardless, that burn rate, 40,000 a day, is not something that anyone could maintain at length. So while the Ukrainians have been using more and more artillery with higher and higher range and more accuracy, more and more intelligently, Russia's been shifting in the other direction, using older and older shells which have a higher chance of blowing up in the barrel or not detonating when they actually arrive, and the logistical trail of getting that stuff to the front is getting longer and longer and more disrupted. So rather than the broad, if slow, advances behind a hail of artillery like we were seeing out of the Russians in May and June and early July when I last addressed this topic, instead Russia has been hitting high-profile targets such as train stations and malls, big static things. But those attacks have the feel of being a little bit more than the Russians shooting at things to demonstrate to the world that the Russians can still shoot at things. Tanks and infantry are not following up on any of these attacks, whereas with the Ukrainians, they've very clearly been setting the stage for something much more significant. That much more significant is now on play. On August 29, the Ukrainians began what they claim to be is a significant military offensive to recapture the Kherson region. Now, for those of you who remember back to the beginning of the war, Kherson was the only major city that the Ukrainians ever lost to the Russians. It's the only regional capital, and it was a bit of a surprise because it is in a relatively defensible position on the north side of the Dnieper River. We'll talk about that here in a minute, but first, all the normal things that plague offensives are appropriate to think about here. They trigger higher casualties among the attackers and the defenders. They require more troops. They require better logistics. They're more vulnerable to disruption. All of that stands. Also, you have to consider that this isn't simply Ukraine's first significant offensive in the war, but this is Ukraine's first significant offensive ever. Russia first captured Kiev in the 1600s, and it has been under some flavor of Russian administration almost the entire time since then. There is no national history of military conflict in Ukraine independent of its position as a cog within the Russian system.